Here's what nobody in the poker coaching space wants to admit. You can execute pre-flop perfectly, textbook ranges, correct sizing, disciplined folds, and still be systematically losing money. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right in the wrong room. This is Vinton Poker, precision in, profits out. The topic of today's short talk is why solid pre-flop fundamentals against a wrong opponent profile is just well-executed losing. I'm Vinton. I specialize in one thing, transforming everyday players into highly profitable, exploitative forces at the live tables. If you're tired of break-even sessions and ready to engineer a consistent income stream, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Let me tell you what's actually happening at your table right now. There's a guy 2 seats to your left. He's been limping every other hand. He called a 3-bet out of position with Jack 7 offsuit and flop 2 pair. He's not thinking about ranges. He doesn't even know what a range is. He's playing his cards, his mood, and maybe a little bit of whatever he had at the bar before he sat down. And you are 4-betting your button opens to a precise sizing, holding your dominated aces with discipline, and protecting your check-in range on the big blind like a professional. You're doing everything right, and you're losing to this fucking guy. That's not bad luck. That's a diagnostic failure. You've correctly diagnosed what optimal play looks like in a vacuum. You've completely misdiagnosed the market you're operating in. This is the most expensive kind of wrong that there is at the poker table, because at least when you make an obvious mistake, some part of your brain registers that error. You feel it. You can fix it. But when you're technically correct and strategically bleeding, your brain gives you no signal. You walk away thinking you played well. You did play well. You just played well against an opponent who doesn't respond to what you're doing. The market punished you, and you didn't even notice the invoice. So let's talk about what pre-flop fundamentals actually are, what they're designed to do, and why deploying them without an opponent profile calibration is essentially running a sophisticated operation in a market that rewards unsophisticated behavior. Pre-flop strategy, at its core, is a system for managing equity distribution before community cards arrive. The decisions you make before the flop, which hands to open, which hands to 3-bet, which hands to fold, how much to size, those decisions determine the shape of every pot you enter. Get them right, and you enter pots with range advantage, positional leverage, and initiative. Get them wrong, and you're playing catch up from the moment the flop lands. The textbook framework is sound. Open your strongest hands in early position. Expand as position improves, 3-bet for value, and as bluff roughly in the right ratios. Fold the bottom of your range when facing aggression. If you've studied, you know all of this. And if you've studied, you probably also noticed that knowing this hasn't made you as much money as it should. Here's the mechanism of the failure. The textbook was written against a theoretical opponent, a balanced, somewhat rational player who responds to pressure by folding, who 3-bets with sensible range, who doesn't call a 4-bet with suited connectors because he had a feeling. The theoretical opponent doesn't exist at most live tables. And when you deploy a strategy designed for a theoretical opponent against an actual human being who just doesn't behave theoretically, your strategy's edge degrades and sometimes inverts entirely. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. You're in the middle position, you open to 3 big blinds with ace-king offsuit. It's standard and correct. A player in the big blind who's been calling nearly every raise he calls. The flop comes king 7-2 rainbow. You have top pair, top kicker. You bet 2/3 pot, he calls. Turn is a blank. You bet again. He calls again. River is another blank. You bet for value. He calls and shows you king 5 offsuit. Now, was your pre-flop play correct? Absolutely. Ace king is a mandatory open from middle position. Was your post-flop play reasonable? Largely yes. Did you extract maximum value from this hand? No, because a player who calls with king 5 is not responding to your bet sizing the way a calibrated opponent would. He's not thinking about your ranges. He's thinking about his king. He was going to call you on every street regardless of your sizing. You could have bet larger on every street and extracted significantly more. Your technically correct sizing was optimized for an opponent who doesn't exist at this table. That's a small example. The principle scales to everything pre-flop and beyond. Here's the PIPO framework applied directly to this problem. PIPO, precision in, profits out. That's not a slogan. It's an operating principle. Precision in means the quality of the information you feed into your decisions, specifically your read on the opponent's profile, their tendencies, their leaks, their response patterns. That information is the input. The output, profit out part, is only as clean as the input is accurate. If you're feeding generic solver optimized decisions into a table full of players who don't respond to solver logic, your output is degraded. You're running a precision instrument in an environment that doesn't reward precision. The instrument isn't broken. Your calibration is off. Now let's get specific about the pre-flop adjustments that actually matter when you're profiling your table correctly. The first adjustment is open sizing. Most players who have studied the game have landed on something like 2.5 to 3 big blinds as a standard open. Against a field of competent players, this is defensible. It limits the price you're paying to steal. It's balanced. It doesn't bloat the pot unnecessarily. Against a field of loose passive players who are going to call regardless of sizing, you're leaving money on the table every single time you open. If the player in the big blind is calling 60% of raises, you should be opening larger with your value hands. Not recklessly larger, purposely larger, because the pot odds math changes when your opponent is calling way too wide. Think about it like this. If you open to 3 big blinds and you get called by someone playing too loose, you're building a pot where your edge is real, but your extraction is capped by your own sizing discipline. If you open to 4 or 4.5 big blinds against that same player and he still calls, which he will, because his calling frequency doesn't respond to your sizing, you've extracted 50% more pre-flop equity with zero additional risk to your hand selection. That's not aggression for its own sake. That's opponent profile informed capital extraction. The second adjustment is 3-bet frequency and sizing. Here's where a lot of technically proficient players bleed in ways they never catch. They have learned to 3-bet a balanced range, value hands, some bluffs, roughly the right ratio. Against a competent opponent who folds to 3-bets at a reasonable frequency, this works. Against a calling station who folds to 3-bets maybe 30% of the time instead of the 55 to 60% of the time that you need for your bluffs to break even, you're burning money on every light 3-bet. That break-even math is not complicated. If you 3-bet to 9 big blinds over a 3 big blind open, you're risking 9 to win roughly 4.5 in dead money. You need that bluff to work 67% of the times roughly to break even on that immediate action, ignoring any post-flop play. If your opponent is only folding 30% of the time, you're not even close to breaking even. You are making a donation with a hand history attached. That's it. The solution isn't to stop 3-betting. The solution is to 3-bet for value more, 3-bet as bluff far less, And when you do bluff, do it against the players who actually fold, not the ones who call because they just want to see a flop. This sounds obvious when I say it out loud, but watch how many players at the live tables continue to run balanced 3-bet ranges against players who are constitutionally incapable of folding. They've learned the theory. They haven't applied the profile filter. That filter is PIPO, precision in, profits out. The third adjustment is calling ranges in the blinds. This is where even solid players hemorrhage equity in ways that don't show up obviously in the moment. The standard advice is to defend your big blind at a frequency that makes the opener indifferent to steal. Roughly, you need to call often enough that the opener can't profit with any two cards. Against a competent opener, this is correct. Against the tight, value-heavy opener who's opening 15% of hands from early position, your wide defense range is running into the top of the range repeatedly. You're defending correctly against the theoretical average opener and getting crushed by this specific player's actual range. Here's the numbers that matter. If a player is opening 15% of hands from early position, the average hand in their range is significantly stronger than the average hand in a player opening 25% of the times. Your calling range needs to be contracted accordingly. Not because calling is wrong in principle, because the equity you're buying with your call is less than you think it is against a specific opponent's specific range. You're overpaying for a hand that's more dominated than your model assumes. And this is the core of what I want for you to sit with. Every pre-flop decision you make is implicitly a bet on your model of your opponent's range. If your model is wrong, if you're using a generic range estimate instead of a PIPO-informed read, your decision is built on a bad data set. The decision might look correct, the logic chain might be sound, but if the wrong input is entered, the output is going to be invariably wrong. Garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter how clean your math is if you're running it on faulty assumptions. Now, I want to address something that comes up every time I talk about opponent profiling adjustments. Someone always says, well, that doesn't mean I should just play exploitatively and forget about fundamentals entirely. No, absolutely not. And this is very, very critical, and it's a critical distinction. Fundamentals are the foundation. They are the baseline that keeps you from making catastrophically bad decisions. If you don't know your pre-flop ranges, if you can't estimate pot odds, if you don't understand position, then you have nothing to adjust from. You're not exploiting anyone. You're just guessing with extra steps. The fundamentals are the skeleton. The opponent profile adjustment is the muscular structure that makes the skeleton move effectively. What I'm diagnosing here is not a failure of fundamentals. It's a failure to recognize that fundamentals are context dependent. The fundamental principle is not to open to 2.5 big blinds. The fundamental principle is to open to a size that maximizes your expected value given your hand strength, position, and opponent tendencies. The specific number is a variable. The principle is the constant. Players who've learned the specific number without internalizing the principle are executing the output of someone else's context and applying it into a different context entirely. That's where the leak lives. Now, let me also talk about the psychological mechanism that keeps this leak alive, because it's not just knowledge gap. It's an ego architecture problem. When you study pre-flop strategy, you build a model of correct play. That model feels good. It feels professional. It feels like you've done the work. And when you sit down at a table and execute that model cleanly, you fold the dominated hands, you open the right frequencies, you size correctly. There is a quiet satisfaction in that. You're playing correctly. You know you're playing correctly. And that feeling of correctness is frankly addictive. The problem is that correctness in a vacuum and profitability in context are not the same thing, but they feel similar. And when results are mixed, when you're running flat or slightly down, your brain reaches for comforting explanations like variance. I played correctly. The results will come. And sometimes that's true. Variance is real. But sometimes the flat results are telling you something specific. They're telling you that your correct play is being deployed against opponents who don't respond to it the way your model predicts. That's not variance. That's a calibration error. The short term is, as I've always said before, a notorious liar. It will reward bad play and punish good play with equal indifference. But over a meaningful sample size, if you are technically proficient and still bleeding, the diagnosis is not variance. The diagnosis is that your precision is being applied imprecisely. You're bringing a scalpel to the right operation on the wrong patient. Here's where I want to be direct about the cost of this error, because it's not the pots you don't win. It's the pots you actively lose because you're playing a strategy that your opponent is inadvertently punishing. Every time you fold a hand, your opponent would have paid you off. Every time you size for balance against a player who doesn't balance. Every time you 3-bet bluff against a calling station. Those aren't missed opportunities. They're active negative EV decisions that compound across every session. You are, in the language of the market, subsidizing the pool. You are providing liquidity to the table's better players and calling it discipline. The cure is not to abandon discipline. The cure is to apply discipline to the right variable. Instead of disciplining yourself to execute a fixed preflop system, discipline yourself to profile every player at the table before you finalize your approach. That profiling, that PIPO-informed input, is the work that separates technically correct players from consistently profitable players. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, okay, I get it, but how do I actually know where I'm leaking? How do I know if my pre-flop adjustments are off or if it's something else? That's exactly the right question. That is exactly what the Leak Hunter diagnostic was built for. Most players who use it find that they're losing money in spots that they genuinely believed that they were winning. Not because they're bad players, because they're applying correct logic to incorrect assumptions about their opponents. If you want to take this free Leak Hunter diagnostic, the link is in the description, or just go to audit.vintonpoker.com. It's absolutely free, so take it before your next session. Now let me bring this home with the frame that I want you to carry out of this video. Pre-flop is not a checklist. It's a negotiation. Every decision you make before the flop is a negotiation between your hand equity, your positional advantage, and your opponent's likely response. Two of these three variables are fixed the moment you look at your cards. The third, your opponent's likely response, is entirely determined by how accurately you've profiled them. And that profile is not given to you by the solver. It's earned by watching, cataloging, and applying what you observe. The player who opens ace-king to 3 big blinds because that's what the chart says, and the player who opens ace-king to 4.5 big blinds because the player in the big blind calls 70% of raises and never 3-bets without the nuts, those two players are making different decisions. One of them is executing a system, the other is playing poker. The market pays the second player way more, not because the chart is wrong, because the chart was never designed to replace observation. You can be technically correct and strategically bleeding. That's the most expensive kind of wrong that there is at the table, because it feels like competence while it costs you money. The goal is not to play correctly. The goal is to play profitably. Those overlap heavily, but they are not identical. And in the gap between them is where your edge lives, only if you're willing to do the work of closing it. Question for you to ponder. If you reviewed your last 10 sessions and removed every hand where you were certain you played correctly, how many of those correct decisions were actually calibrated to the specific opponent in front of you? And how many were just default moves from a system you learned somewhere else? Tell me your answers in the comments below. I read them all. And if you want to keep improving and crushing, watch this next video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future episodes. Your support helps this channel grow, and it means a lot to me. If you got value from this episode, give it a like and share it with someone else who's also serious about leveling up and becoming a crusher just like you. Want more strategy, structure, and tools that actually work? Head over to vintonpoker.com and join my free newsletter. Thanks for watching. I'm Vinton, and I'll see you in the next episode.